The autumn wind swept across the Red River Valley, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and broken dreams. Will Crawford stood on his sagging porch, surveying what remained of his once proud ranch with eyes that had forgotten hope. The corrals stood empty, their wooden rails weathered gray as tombstones, while the main house leaned slightly to one side like a man carrying too much sorrow. At 32, Will looked a decade older, his face carved hollow by grief and whiskey, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been strong enough to wrestle steers to the ground. The bottle in his hand caught the dying light, amber liquid sloshing with each tremor of his unsteady grip, inside the dim kitchen. Will stared at the letter that had arrived that morning. The bank's ultimatum printed in stark black ink that seemed to blur before his alcohol-clouded vision. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days unless he could produce payment on the overdue mortgage, a sum that might as well have been the moon for all his ability to reach it. The ghost of his partner Jacob seemed to hover in every shadow of the house they'd built together. Accusing eyes that followed Will's every movement since that terrible night when the horse had spooked and Jacob had fallen beneath hooves and wheels. Will's hands shook as he poured another drink, the whiskey burning away the memory of Jacob's final words. The way his friend had reached out as if Will could somehow pull him back from death's embrace. The autumn rain began as Will made his way to Dustwood, the territorial town that squatted beside the railroad tracks like something waiting to be forgotten, his horse's hooves squelched in the mud of Main streets, while the few remaining merchants watched him pass with the mixture of pity and distaste reserved for those who'd fallen from grace. The Crawford name had once meant something in these parts: quality cattle, fair dealing, and hands that could turn prairie grass into profit. But now Will was just another broken dreamer whose luck had run out. He tied his horse outside McMurphy's saloon, the familiar creak of the batwing doors welcoming him into the amber gloom where men came to drown their failures in rotgut whiskey and empty promises. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The medicine show's arrival shattered the town's evening quiet like thunder across still water, with painted wagons rolling down Main Street followed by a brass band that played with more enthusiasm than skill. Dr. Elias Thornfield stood atop his medicine wagon, a silver-tongued showman whose voice carried promises of miracle cures and wonders beyond imagination. But it was the announcement of the evening's labor auction that caught Will's whiskey-soaked attention. People desperate enough could sell their work contracts to pay off debts, Thornfield explained with theatrical flair, a practice that skirted the edges of territory law but provided solutions for those with nowhere else to turn. Will stumbled from the saloon into the growing crowd, drawn by morbid curiosity and the bottle's false courage, watching as desperate souls prepared to auction away pieces of their lives for coin. Among the assembled crowd, Grace Evelyn Murphy stood with quiet dignity despite her obvious poverty, her dark hair pinned severely back and her simple dress mended with careful stitches that spoke of pride in the face of hardship. She clutched a worn leather Bible in her hands while Dr. Thornfield explained her situation to the gathering crowd. Orphaned when her preacher father died of consumption in the territorial capital, left with nothing but medical debts that consumed even the sale of their meager possessions, her green eyes held neither shame nor defeat, only a calm acceptance that seemed to glow in the lamplight like something sacred hidden among the profane carnival atmosphere. When she stepped onto the makeshift platform, her back straight and her chin raised, she looked less like merchandise and more like Joan of Arc facing her judges. The bidding began with cruel laughter and crude comments from men who saw only a young woman's desperation, their offers ranging from $2 to work in saloons to $3.54 kitchen duty in the town's boarding house. Will watched from the back of the crowd, his vision swimming with drink and something else he couldn't name, as Grace maintained her composure despite the degrading auction that reduced her to chattel in the eyes of territorial law. When the bidding stalled at $4 from a leering merchant who detailed exactly what kind of work he had in mind, Will found himself stumbling forward, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur with unexpected authority. $5, he called out, the words falling from his lips before his mind could catch them, sealing both their fates with drunken impulse that felt surprisingly like providence. The morning after brought Will the harsh clarity of sobriety and the full weight of his impulsive purchase, as Grace sat across from his kitchen table like a judgment made flesh. She had arrived at dawn, carrying her few possessions in a carpet bag worn smooth by travel. her composure intact despite spending the night in the medicine show wagon with only Dr. Thornfield's wife for protection. Will's hands trembled as he attempted to make coffee, spilling grounds across the scarred wooden table while Grace watched with eyes that seemed to see straight through his shame to something deeper underneath. The awkward silence stretched between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross, filled with unspoken questions about what exactly their arrangement meant in the harsh light of day. Grace broke the silence with words that cut through Will's hangover like cold water on burned skin, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone raised on scripture and hard truth. "Mr. Crawford, I understand you paid for a year's labor contract, but I need you to know that's all you purchased. My work, not my person," she said, meeting his eyes with steady resolve that made him look away first. Will found himself nodding, surprising them both with his agreement, the words coming out rough but sincere. "I'm not that kind of man, Miss Murphy, whatever else I might be." In that moment, both of them chose to trust rather than fear, Will committing to honor rather than exploit her vulnerability, while Grace decided to see potential for redemption rather than another man who might use her desperation against her. As Grace surveyed the ranch in the pale morning light, Will watched her face carefully for signs of horror or dismay at the scale of decay that surrounded them. The fences sagged like broken dreams, the barn roof leaked in a dozen places, and weeds grew where once prized cattle had grazed on carefully maintained pastures. But instead of despair, he saw something else in her expression, a thoughtful assessment, the way her father might have looked at a struggling congregation and seen souls worth saving rather than lost causes. "It has good bones," she said finally, running her hand along a fence post that still stood straight despite its weathered surface. "My father always said the Lord provided the raw materials, but expected us to do the building." Grace's first task was to establish order in the chaos of Will's abandoned household, approaching the work with the systematic efficiency of someone who had kept a preacher's home running on donated goods and community charity. She found the kitchen stocked with nothing but whiskey and hardtack, the bedroom buried under months of unwashed clothes, and every surface covered with the dust of neglect and despair. But rather than judgment, her movements carried compassion, as if she understood that the external mess was merely a reflection of the internal wreckage that alcohol and guilt had wrought. By noon, she had managed to create something resembling order from the chaos, humming hymns while she worked, the sound filling spaces that had been silent too long. The first real conversation came that evening over a simple meal that Grace had somehow conjured from the ranch's meager supplies, her questions about the land and livestock gentle but persistent enough to draw out Will's story. He found himself speaking of Jacob for the first time since the accident, words tumbling out like water through a broken dam, how they'd built the ranch together, dreamed of herds that would stretch to the horizon, planned families and futures that seemed as solid as the Oklahoma earth beneath their feet. Grace listened without interruption, her presence creating a space safe enough for grief to finally find voice. And when Will's words finally ran dry, she simply nodded and said, "He must have been a good friend to inspire such loyalty." The understanding in her voice nearly broke him. That night, as autumn wind rattled the loose shingles overhead, Grace knelt beside her narrow cot in the ranch's unused back room and opened her father's Bible, two passages that had carried her through her own darkest hours. Will, lying sleepless in his own bed, could hear the soft murmur of her prayers through the thin walls, words that seemed to wrap around the old house like protective arms and transform the familiar spaces into something new. For the first time in months, the ranch felt less like a tomb and more like a place where healing might be possible, where two broken people might somehow find a way to build something whole from the pieces of their shattered dreams. The whiskey bottle sat untouched on his bedside table, its amber contents reflecting the moonlight, like liquid temptation that had somehow lost its power to call his name. Dawn brought Grace to the corral with a calm confidence that surprised Will, her movements around the remaining horses speaking of experience that went far deeper than book learning. She had grown up moving from settlement to settlement with her father, she explained, staying with farming families who opened their doors to the traveling preacher and his daughter in exchange for spiritual guidance and extra hands during harvest time. "Cattle, horses, sheep, they're all God's creatures with their own wisdom," she said, running gentle hands along the flank of Will's old mare, Bessie, who had been skittish around strangers since Jacob's accident. Under Grace's touch, the horse settled with surprising trust, ears forward and muscles relaxing, as if sensing the woman's genuine care and competence. The first weeks established a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Will. His days structured around Grace's quiet insistence on purpose rather than the aimless drift toward the whiskey bottle that had become his routine. She woke before dawn for prayers and planning, spent her mornings assessing the ranch's needs, and her afternoons implementing practical solutions with materials scrounged from the property's forgotten corners. Will found himself following her lead, almost without conscious decision, his hands remembering skills they'd thought forgotten as they worked together to mend fences, patch the barn roof, and clear weeds from pastures that might someday hold cattle again. The work was hard but honest, and for the first time in months, Will fell asleep from exhaustion rather than drink. Grace's knowledge revealed itself in unexpected moments, the way she could read weather signs in cloud formations, predict which areas of pasture would hold grass longest through drought, and identify medicinal plants that grew wild along the creek beds. She had absorbed not just her father's theological wisdom but also the practical knowledge of every farming family they'd stayed with, carrying in her memory a library of frontier survival skills that transformed problems into opportunities. When she suggested they start with sheep rather than cattle, pointing out that the Rocky Hills would support smaller flocks while they rebuilt their resources, Will realized he was listening to someone who understood the land's potential better than he'd ever imagined possible. The first real test of their partnership came when Will discovered Grace in his kitchen at midnight, kneading bread dough with tears streaming down her face in silent rivers of grief. The anniversary of her father's death had arrived without warning, bringing with it the full weight of everything she'd lost, not just a parent, but a calling, a community, and a sense of purpose that had defined her entire life. Will stood in the doorway, uncertain how to offer comfort, his own experience with loss making him understand the inadequacy of words in the face of such profound sorrow. Finally, he simply sat at the table and waited, offering his presence rather than empty platitudes, until Grace's tears subsided and she began to speak of her father's faith, and the fear that she might not be strong enough to honor his memory. The quiet hours before dawn, Grace shared stories that painted pictures of a man who had carried God's word to frontier settlements with nothing but a worn Bible and unshakable faith in human goodness. Reverend Murphy had believed that every soul was worth saving, she explained, and that redemption was always possible for those willing to do the hard work of changing their hearts along with their circumstances. Will listened with growing understanding, recognizing in her father's philosophy the same stubborn hope that had brought Jacob West to build something better than what they'd left behind. He used to say that the frontier needed more than just settlers, Grace whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. It needed people willing to build communities where broken things could be made whole again. As autumn turned toward winter, Will realized that Grace had become more than a hired hand or even a friend. She had become the anchor that kept him from drifting back into the dark waters of guilt and despair. Her quiet faith didn't demand conversion or confession, but simply offered an alternative to the self-destruction that had nearly claimed his life, showing through example that purpose could be found even in the aftermath of devastating loss. When she mentioned her contract would expire with spring's arrival, Will felt something close to panic at the thought of losing the peace her presence had brought to the ranch. The realization surprised him with its intensity, making him understand that somewhere in the daily rhythm of shared work and quiet conversations, his heart had learned to hope again. Winter's arrival brought both challenges and revelations, as Grace's organizational skills transformed the ranch's preparation from desperate scrambling into methodical planning that seemed to anticipate every need. She had Will splitting wood for fuel, preserving vegetables from her hastily planted garden, and winterizing the buildings with repairs that showed her deep understanding of frontier survival. But it was her suggestion to use the cold months for planning the ranch's rebirth that truly demonstrated her vision. Spreading hand-drawn maps across the kitchen table that showed pasture rotation, water management, and livestock placement with the precision of someone trained in agricultural science, my father believed in preparing for the future, even when the present looked hopeless. She explained, her pencil sketching irrigation lines that could transform the ranch's productivity. The discovery of Grace's true background came gradually, revealed in fragments of conversation that painted a picture far more complex than Will had initially understood. Her father hadn't been just any frontier preacher, but Reverend Josiah Murphy, whose reputation for establishing successful farming communities stretched from Kansas to Texas. Grace had been his partner in this work, not merely his daughter, learning animal husbandry, crop rotation, and community organization from practical application rather than textbook study. She spoke casually of innovations they'd implemented, drought-resistant grazing patterns, cooperative breeding programs, and marketing strategies that had helped struggling settlements become thriving towns. Will began to understand that Grace wasn't just offering to help rebuild his ranch. She was offering to transform it into something better than it had ever been. The first signs of external threat arrived with the December snow, in the form of Luther Kane and his riders from the Territorial Capital, men whose fine clothes and soft hands marked them as the kind of businessmen who made profit from other people's misery. Kane introduced himself as a representative of territorial development interests, offering to buy Will's land at a fraction of its value, with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to desperate sellers. When Will refused, Kane's smile turned cold as winter wind, his words carrying veiled threats about foreclosure proceedings and the unfortunate accidents that sometimes befell those who stood in the way of progress. Grace watched the exchange from the kitchen doorway, her face calm but her hands gripping her father's Bible with white-knuckled intensity that spoke of recognition and fear. After Kane's departure, Grace revealed the true scope of the threat they faced, her knowledge of territorial politics, painting a grim picture of corruption and manipulation that reached far beyond Will's personal struggles. She had seen similar tactics in other communities where her father had worked. Powerful men using legal technicalities and financial pressure to acquire land from struggling settlers at pennies on the dollar. "They're not just after your ranch," she explained, spreading local property maps across the table with the systematic thoroughness of a military strategist. "They want the entire river valley for railroad development, and they'll use whatever methods necessary to clear out the current owners." Will realized that his fight for survival had become part of a larger battle for the soul of the territory itself. Grace's plan to counter the threat revealed the full extent of her strategic thinking, as she outlined a community defense that would make it impossible for Kane's group to isolate individual ranchers and force quick sales. She proposed organizing the scattered farmers and ranchers into a cooperative that could share resources, coordinate legal defense, and present a united front against outside pressure. Her experience helping her father build congregations had taught her that strength came through unity, and she began reaching out to neighbors Will Burley knew, carrying letters and organizing meetings with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood how to build movements from scattered individuals. The transformation of his isolated struggle into a community cause filled Will with something he'd almost forgotten: the possibility of victory against overwhelming odds. The community response exceeded even Grace's optimistic projections, as families throughout the Red River Valley recognized the threat to their own survival in Will's situation and rallied with donations of time, materials, and expertise that demonstrated the frontier spirit at its finest. Barn-raising traditions were adapted to ranch repair, with neighbors arriving each weekend carrying tools and supplies that transformed months of work into manageable projects. Grace organized these efforts with the skill of a seasoned campaign manager, coordinating work crews, managing supplies, and maintaining morale with a combination of practical efficiency and spiritual inspiration that reminded everyone why they'd come west in the first place. Will watched in amazement as his dying ranch became the center of something larger and more powerful than he'd ever imagined possible. The threat escalated dramatically when fire swept through Will's rebuilt hay barn on a windless February night, the flames too evenly distributed and too perfectly timed to be anything but arson, designed to destroy the community's investment and break their resistance. Grace stood beside Will in the snow-covered yard, watching months of work and precious winter feed disappear into smoke and ash, while riders in the distance observed their handiwork with satisfied attention before melting back into the darkness. The message was clear and terrifying. Kane's group would escalate their tactics until the community's resolve broke, using violence and intimidation to achieve what legal pressure had failed to accomplish. As dawn revealed the full extent of the destruction, Will felt the familiar pull of despair and whiskey, while Grace's face set with determination that suggested the real battle was only beginning. The morning after the fire brought an unexpected visitor whose arrival changed everything. Sheriff Daniel Kowalski, a weathered lawman whose reputation for honesty made him rare among territorial officials, came bearing both sympathy and crucial information about Kane's operations. He revealed that similar fires had occurred throughout the territory wherever communities had organized resistance to forced land sales, creating a pattern of intimidation that had been carefully hidden from official investigation. Kowalski's presence offered more than just validation of their suspicions. It provided legal protection and the possibility of building a case against Kane's group that could end their reign of terror. Grace listened intently as the sheriff outlined what evidence would be needed, her mind already working on strategies to gather proof, while protecting the community from further retaliation. Grace's response to the fire's destruction revealed depths of strength and faith that transformed catastrophe into opportunity. As she organized the community's recovery with renewed determination that seemed to draw power from adversity itself. Within days of the barn's destruction, she had established alternative feed sources through cooperative agreements with ranchers from neighboring counties, arranged temporary shelter for Will's small livestock herd, and initiated plans for a new barn designed with fire-resistant construction techniques her father had learned from German immigrants in Kansas. Her ability to find hope and practical solutions in the face of deliberate sabotage inspired the community to deeper commitment, turning Kane's intimidation tactics into a rallying cry that strengthened rather than weakened their resolve to resist outside pressure. The crucial revelation came through Grace's methodical investigation of property records and territorial documents. Research that uncovered the true scope of Kane's conspiracy and provided the evidence Sheriff Kowalski needed to take official action. Working late into the night by lamplight, Grace traced patterns of land acquisition that revealed systematic fraud, forged documents, and bribery that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Her father's training in careful documentation and logical analysis proved invaluable as she built an ironclad case that could expose not just Kane's local operations, but an entire network of corruption that threatened honest settlers throughout the territory. The evidence was damning enough to bring down powerful men, making Grace and Will targets for more than just economic pressure. Sheriff Kowalski's examination of Grace's research confirmed their worst fears about the danger they faced, but also provided the legal framework needed to protect the community and bring Kane's group to justice. The sheriff explained that Grace's evidence was sufficient to trigger territorial investigation, but warned that the conspiracy's reach made them vulnerable to retaliation from sources they couldn't predict or defend against through normal means. He offered to coordinate with federal marshals who had been investigating similar patterns in other territories, creating a larger case that could provide protection through visibility and official attention. The alliance between local law enforcement and federal investigation offered hope for justice, but also escalated the stakes to life-and-death levels that tested everyone's commitment to seeing the fight through to its conclusion. The arrival of Federal Marshal Sarah Catherine Blake transformed their local struggle into part of a broader campaign for territorial justice. As the marshal revealed that Grace's research had provided the missing pieces needed to prosecute a conspiracy that stretched across multiple territories and involved millions of dollars in fraudulent land deals, Marshal Blake was a formidable woman whose reputation for incorruptible law enforcement had made her legendary throughout the frontier. And her presence offered protection that even Kane's group wouldn't dare challenge directly. More importantly, she recognized in Grace a kindred spirit whose combination of moral courage and practical skills made her an invaluable ally in the broader fight against territorial corruption. The marshals offered to make Grace an official consultant to the federal investigation, provided both protection and purpose that aligned perfectly with her father's legacy of building communities based on justice and mutual support. The final confrontation began when Kane's desperation drove him to abandon subtle intimidation in favor of direct assault, as armed riders surrounded the ranch during a community meeting and demanded immediate surrender of all property documents under threat of violence. Against everyone present, the families gathered in Will's rebuilt barn found themselves trapped between men who had clearly moved beyond legal or economic pressure into outright criminal behavior. Their children crying and their dreams of peaceful settlement dissolved in the face of naked threats. Will felt the familiar paralysis of fear that had consumed him since Jacob's death, while Grace stood calmly among the terrified families, her presence providing an anchor of courage that kept panic from becoming complete chaos as she quietly organized resistance among people who had never imagined they would need to fight for their lives. Grace's transformation from preacher's daughter to frontier leader became complete as she took charge of the crisis with authority that brooked no argument, organizing the trapped families into defensive positions, while sending children to safety through secret passages she'd discovered during her systematic exploration of the property. Her commands carried the weight of someone who had found her true calling in the crucible of mortal danger. Drawing on reserves of strength and tactical knowledge that seemed to come from some deep well of ancestral memory, she coordinated signals with Sheriff Kowalski and Marshal Blake, who had positioned themselves strategically around the ranch in anticipation of exactly this kind of escalation, turning Kane's trap into an ambush that would finally provide the evidence needed to end his reign of terror once and for all. Will's moment of transformation arrived when one of Kane's men threatened Grace directly. The sight of a gun pointed at the woman who had saved his soul, breaking through months of self and paralyzing guilt to reveal the man Jacob had once known and trusted. The rage that filled him was clean and purposeful, burning away the whiskey haze and self-pity that had clouded his judgments since the accident, replacing fear with protective fury that reminded him what it meant to have something worth fighting for. He moved with coordination and strength that surprised everyone, including himself, disarming the gunman and creating the opening that allowed Sheriff Kowalski and Marshal Blake to overwhelm Kane's remaining followers. In that moment of decisive action, Will reclaimed not just his courage but his identity as someone worthy of Grace's faith and love. The aftermath of Kane's defeat brought revelations that tested everyone's faith in justice and community, as the full extent of territorial corruption was exposed through trials that revealed how close honest settlers had come to losing everything to systematic fraud. Grace's evidence proved crucial in convictions that sent shockwaves throughout the territory, establishing legal precedents that protected small farmers and ranchers from similar schemes, while demonstrating the power of organized community resistance to overcome seemingly impossible odds. But the personal cost was enormous. Grace had been forced to relive her father's death through testimony about similar schemes that had destroyed other communities, while Will had to confront the reality that his partner Jacob's accident might have been related to his investigation of suspicious land deals rather than simple bad luck. The victory was complete but bittersweet, purchased with emotional wounds that would take time and love to heal. Spring's arrival brought both renewal and reckoning, as the legal victory over Kane's conspiracy created opportunities for rebuilding that exceeded anyone's original dreams, while the emotional aftermath of the confrontation forced Will and Grace to finally address the feelings that had grown between them through months of shared struggle and mutual dependence. The ranch showed signs of genuine prosperity for the first time since Jacob's death, with healthy livestock, productive fields, and the kind of systematic improvements that promised long-term success rather than mere survival. But the personal questions remained unresolved. Grace's contract had expired. Her work with Marshal Blake offered opportunities throughout the territory, and neither she nor Will had spoken aloud the hopes and fears that made every conversation charged with unspoken possibilities. Grace's announcement that she had been offered a permanent position with the Federal Marshal Service created the crisis that forced both of them to confront their feelings, as the prospect of separation made clear how thoroughly their lives had become intertwined through months of shared purpose and mutual support. Her work had attracted attention from territorial officials who recognized her unique combination of organizational skills, moral courage, and practical knowledge as exactly what was needed to help establish stable governance in newly opened territories. The offer represented everything her father had worked toward: the opportunity to build communities based on justice and mutual support. But it would mean leaving behind the personal happiness she had found in rebuilding Will's ranch and healing his wounded soul. Will's response revealed the depth of his transformation from broken drunk to restored man, as he encouraged Grace to accept the marshal position despite his own desire for her to stay, demonstrating that his love was strong enough to put her welfare and calling above his personal wishes. He had learned from her example that true love meant supporting someone's highest purpose rather than trying to bind them to your own needs. And his willingness to let her go proved that the selfish man who had bought her contract in a drunken stupor had been replaced by someone worthy of her respect and affection. The conversation took place in the small chapel Grace had built on ranch property, surrounded by symbols of faith and community that reminded both of them how their individual healing had become part of something larger and more enduring than either had imagined possible. Grace's decision to decline the marshal position came not from duty or obligation, but from the recognition that her true calling lay in building the kind of community her father had always envisioned, right there, in the Red River Valley, where they had already laid the foundation for something unprecedented in frontier history. She realized that the ranch had become the center of a network of mutual support and cooperative prosperity that could serve as a model for territorial development, proving that communities could thrive through collaboration rather than exploitation. Her choice represented not sacrifice but fulfillment, the understanding that sometimes the most important work happens not in grand gestures but in the patient cultivation of relationships and institutions that make ordinary miracles possible. The final test of their partnership came when territorial officials arrived to investigate reports that the community cooperative violated federal regulations about land use and settlement patterns, threatening to dissolve the arrangements that had made their collective success possible. Grace and Will stood together before the Territorial Commission, presenting their case with evidence that demonstrated how cooperative development had created more stable settlement, higher productivity, and stronger community institutions than individual competition had ever achieved. Their testimony drew on months of careful documentation and the support of dozens of families whose lives had been transformed through mutual aid and shared resources, creating an argument for a different model of frontier development that challenged assumptions about individual versus community success. The Commission's decision would determine not just their personal future, but the viability of an alternative approach to territorial development that could influence settlement patterns throughout the American West. The Territorial Commission's unanimous approval of the Red River Valley Cooperative created legal precedent that protected not just their community but similar arrangements throughout the territory, establishing a new model for frontier development that balanced individual opportunity with collective support. The decision represented victory on multiple levels: legal validation of their approach, economic security for all member families, and personal vindication for Grace's faith that communities could thrive through cooperation rather than competition. Will watched with pride as Grace presented their final documentation to the Commission, seeing in her confident testimony the complete fulfillment of her father's legacy and the emergence of a new kind of frontier leadership that combined spiritual wisdom with practical expertise. The community celebration that followed the Commission's decision revealed how thoroughly the cooperative had transformed not just economic relationships but the social fabric of the entire valley, creating bonds of mutual support and shared purpose that made everyone stronger than they could have been alone. Families who had arrived as strangers struggling for individual survival had become extended family united by common values and mutual aid, while the ranch itself had evolved from a place of private grief into the heart of a thriving community that embodied the best possibilities of frontier life. Grace moved through the celebration with quiet satisfaction, receiving thanks and congratulations that recognized her role in creating something unprecedented in territorial history, a community that had succeeded through cooperation rather than conquest. The wedding ceremony that united Will and Grace took place in the chapel she had built, with Marshall Blake performing the service and the entire cooperative community serving as witnesses to vows that celebrated not just personal love but commitment to the shared values that had made their success possible. Their marriage represented the complete integration of individual healing with community purpose, as two people who had found each other in circumstances of desperate need, committed to building a future based on faith, mutual support, and service to something larger than themselves. The ceremony concluded with the dedication of the chapel as a permanent community center, ensuring that the spiritual foundation of their cooperative would endure for future generations who would benefit from the model they had established. 1 year later, the Red River Valley Cooperative had become a destination for visitors from throughout the territory and beyond, as government officials, social reformers, and frontier families came to study a community that had achieved prosperity through collaboration rather than competition. Grace served as the cooperative's coordinator, while continuing her work with federal marshals on cases involving territorial corruption, her reputation for integrity and effectiveness making her a sought-after consultant for communities facing similar challenges to those they had overcome. Will managed the ranch operations while serving as an elected representative to the territorial legislature, where he advocated for policies that supported cooperative development and protected small farmers from exploitation by larger interests. The chapel that Grace had built had evolved into the spiritual and social center of a community that attracted new members drawn by stories of mutual support and shared prosperity. With Sunday services that celebrated both individual faith and collective achievement, the sermons delivered there emphasized themes that would have made Reverend Murphy proud: the possibility of redemption for even the most broken souls, the power of community to heal individual wounds, and the responsibility of those who had been blessed to extend that blessing to others in need. Will and Grace took turns leading these services, their partnership in spiritual matters reflecting the equal partnership they had built in all aspects of their life together. As autumn returned to the Red River Valley, Will and Grace stood once again on the porch where their journey had begun, but now they looked out over thriving pastures, prosperous neighbor farms, and a community center bustling with activities that served families throughout the region. The broken man who had spent his last $5 on a stranger's labor contract had become a leader whose vision for cooperative development influenced territorial policy, while the preacher's daughter who had been auctioned to pay her father's debts had fulfilled his legacy by building the kind of community he had always believed was possible. Their story had become part of frontier legend, proving that even the most desperate circumstances could be transformed into opportunities for healing and growth when people chose to see possibilities rather than limitations. The future stretched before them, filled with challenges that would require the same faith and cooperation that had brought them this far. But they faced it together, surrounded by a community that had learned the most important lesson the frontier had to teach: that broken things could indeed be made whole again, if people were willing to do the patient work of building something better from the pieces of their shattered dreams.